Welcome to the train wreck, folks. It's time for another episode of Not Another Baptist Podcast, a podcast exploring church revitalization, church planting, and other Southern Baptist goodies for your ear holes. And today, folks, we have a return victim, and that being Dr. Ken Hemphill. But first, the formalities. I'm Matt Hensley, pastor of Mayhill Baptist. I'm joined by Kyle Bierman of First Baptist Alamogordo. We're both pastoring great churches in southern New Mexico, trying not to drown in the waters of church revitalization. And we're glad that you joined us for our last of the Reclaiming Glory episodes. And today, we're talking specifically about disciple making. Kyle?
Yep. Yeah, and so this is the sixth of six imperatives in Mark Clifton's book, Reclaiming Glory, making disciples who make disciples. And it just made sense to bring Dr. Hemphill back on because, Dr. Hemphill, you've really devoted your life to making disciples. So first of all, tell us how things are going out there on in the Carolinas, and then let's dive in and just talk about making disciples and what that looks like in a church revitalization setting.
Absolutely. Well, it's a beautiful day outside. Sorry I can't turn the camera around that day, but little chilly here. We had the rain as well, and now it's cleared off pretty well. You may not know it, but I'm actually doing an interim in Springfield, Missouri every weekend. So I fly to the Second Baptist Church, and it sleeted on me going through Chicago, so I thought I wasn't going to get home, but made it back, and we got gorgeous weather here. So.
Well, we got gorgeous, but we started this morning at 8 degrees, and I start my mornings on the porch, and this was one where I had one cup of coffee, and I kind of gauge it by how long that cup of coffee stays warm anyway, and it was pretty well iced by the time I got out there. So I just went back in and started doing my reading inside because I was like, I don't have a death wish. But before we dive into anything, we want to do a little accountability here, Dr. Hemphill, because the last time that you were on the episode with us, we talked a little bit about some tree frogs, and then we talked a little bit about your painting. And if I recall, you did make a promise there that you were going to dig out the paint brushes and everything. So let's just be honest. How are we doing about that?
Well, I do know where they are. Since I took this interim in the meantime, and of course, last week, as you will know, I had a D-min that went from 8 in the morning to 4 every afternoon. So I did not dig them out, but I do know that they are here.
Okay. Well, we're moving in the right direction because I'm sure
before the third episode, we may be in line.
Well, and I know, but between now and June, you have absolutely nothing on your plate, right? There's nothing going on in your life, so you'll be
yeah. Well, awesome. Well, Kyle, get us started.
Yeah. So when it comes to talking about making disciples, who then turn around and make disciples, we're given a couple of really clear commands in Scripture. The first one, of course, is the Great Commission, Matthew 28. Right before Jesus ascends into heaven, he gives the disciples their marching orders that are still valid for us today to go and make disciples of all nations. And then later on in 2 Timothy 2:2, Paul kind of lays out a map or a format of what that looks like. What you've heard from me, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. And so there's a command, there's a pattern to not just make disciples, but to train men and women as followers of Christ who can then turn around and train men and women to be followers of Christ, who can train men and women, and you develop a discipleship pattern. Now, in most church revitalization settings, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, one of the reasons that they find themselves in church revitalization is because making disciples has not been a priority. Something else has taken over, whether that's traditions or whatever. As there's many reasons for that, as there are churches that need to be revitalized. So talk to us, Dr. Hemphill, about the need for disciple making and church revitalization and the first steps to get that off the ground that you've seen.
Well, I think you're absolutely on target that it's essential because disciples are reproducing by their very nature. Mm-hmm. So, the imperative in the Great Commission is the single imperative to make a disciple. Then, of course, you have the three participles defining how that goes about. So first of all, you got to evangelize somebody before you can disciple them. Then you've got to congregationalize or baptize, and I take that to be congregationalized. In other words, you can't disciple them if you don't have contact with them on a regular basis. Finally, then teach them to observe everything Jesus commanded. So I meet regularly with a group of pastors that I mentor from year to year, and sometimes educators as well. So one of the questions I posed to them the other day was this question: if you're a disciple making pastor, if you're a disciple making educator or church, the question I want to ask is, what does the disciple look like? How would you know if you had actually finished the project? Right near us here is the BMW plant, and they'll let you do a tour of it, and they generally will start you kind of at the back door. The reason for that is that if they're building a 5 Series coupe, for example, then as you walk backwards through the plant, every piece that comes off of that line, the assembly line, is designed for a 5 Series coupe. So in a sense, once we can say, okay, here's what a disciple looks like, then we can back up in the church and say, okay, here are the pieces we're going to have. So since you guys are the bright ones on the podcast today, let me ask you, what does a disciple look like? How do you define a disciple? I know that wasn't what you planned when I came on.
Well, for me, I think the answer is in some sense of how we set it up in the first place. It's not going to be a matter of, do they look a certain way, of course, whether they're dressing or all of that, but are they now going to be reproducing what they've learned in the first place? And so if I'm leading somebody through the gospel and they get saved and I'm beginning to teach them, some of the first areas of those obedient things that we're talking about are going to be the baptism. It's going to be telling others about Jesus. I think Dr. Queen at Southwestern shares, if you know enough of the gospel to be saved, you know enough of the gospel to tell somebody else how to. And so that would be my answer, but I also know that I'm an idiot. So I'm going to turn it over to Cal, see what he would say.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Well, so disciple was a follower of Christ, right? I mean, that's in the early days, Jesus walked up to guys by the nets on the seashore and said, follow me. And so at its most basic level, a disciple is simply a follower of Christ. Okay. We want to bring somebody into a relationship with Christ and get them to follow him as close as possible and bring others along as well. I don't know if that really answered that.
That's right. Good
definition. Can you please tell him that he's wrong and I'm right?
Well, actually, what I've done in working with churches here in revitalization, I said, okay, let's take a very simple definition. In fact, I had this on good authority because Jesus, when asked about this by a lawyer, said that a man would be one who loves God with all his heart, soul, and mind, loves his neighbor as himself. So I've kind of taken that rather than talking about, does he tithe? Does he do this? Which they're all important. But if you get somebody who truly loves God with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his mind, and of course, Mark adds might, which and his neighbor is himself. Now, Jesus added that from Leviticus 19. So what's interesting here is that you get almost all the, quote, 5 functions of the church in that. You get worship, small group Bible study. You get the aspects of Bible study, the mind, understanding, so the need to know Scripture, etc., and worship, praise through the whole concept. So having said that, that's kind of my definition. So that I want to turn someone into, or allow the Holy Spirit through me to develop people who love God with all their heart, soul, mind, their neighbors, their self, which would then involve fellowship and evangelism. Because, of course, the Good Samaritan story defined neighbor around caring for someone in need in that way, which we would take as evangelism. So, having started with that definition, I would suggest that if we look at Jesus as the model discipler, which obviously he is, then you have things that you would have both what I call intentional strategy and a spontaneous one. Most churches have an intentional strategy, whatever that is, good or bad. We used to have discipleship training at one time called BTU, Baptist, well, You guys are not old enough to know BTU, so let's skip that. But we had all the various initials. That was a program at night that was based around some study guides, whatever that was, the mind of Christ, experiencing God. In other words, we had these tools, and it was and there was nothing wrong with those because they obviously taught disciplines like prayer, perhaps stewardship, things of that nature. But oftentimes we didn't pull in the spontaneous. So if you look at Jesus, there were moments when he stopped and taught the disciples. Many times, well, he tells the parable of the soils. And later on, they want to know, what was that all about? And of course, he has to explain it to them. At other times, we see that it's really just a part of being with Jesus. In other words, they would see him heal someone. And of course, a classic case, they're up on the mountain, Mount Transfiguration. How good does it get to get that close to Jesus? So they go back down, try to do the things they've seen him do, miserable failure, because they can't cast out a little bitty demon there, and he's done the other. So he has to explain to them what was wrong, the lack of prayer and fasting, etc. So we see this all the time. The disciples try to get rid of the kids. He said, whoa, no, suffer the little kids to come unto me. So one of the things that I say to pastors and leaders, you're discipling all the time. So it's not just on Sunday night or Sunday morning or Tuesday night or whenever you schedule a discipleship program or class. People are discipled by your lifestyle, and you've got to teach them to do the same. For example, when I went to Galax, Virginia, which was a kind of a mountain community, about 5,000 population, I lived on Main Street. I bought one of my deacons' homes. It was an old downtown Main Street home. Actually, biggest home I ever lived in. I think it was about 4,500, 5,000 square feet. Had an Esther Williams swimming pool, believe it or not. About a 100-year-old home. But so at any rate, we were on Main Street. So sometimes in the afternoon when I would come home, I would put on my jeans and my boots, and I'd get the stroller out, and I'd push my little girl downtown Main Street. Well, you can't believe the impact that had on that community, where many times men were not seen in a role of kind of taking care of the kids. It was a little more of a kind of a rough and tumble atmosphere. And the fact was that that act in itself, as small as it may have seemed, had an impact on that community about what is right and what is wrong, or what should a man do in relationship to his family. So one of the things I say to the pastors, don't underestimate the spontaneity of going to the hospital with deacons. Don't go there alone. You're wasting time if you do that. Making a visit with someone, whatever it is that you do as a minister, you can include people in that, and that's a part of that discipling process. So that's the first thing I say. The second one is, don't underestimate the power of the pulpit. One of the things that I found in First Norfolk, our church grew from about 380 in Sunday school to about 2,200. And a lot of times I was really frustrated that I didn't have a better program of discipleship. And I think a lot of pastors are, and a lot of churches think, I just don't know that we're doing this as well as we should. And over the years, as I've traveled across our Southern Baptist Convention, I've had the privilege of running into people who were from that church, because Navy tends to move them around. So you just you're in another event or preaching somewhere, and somebody comes up and say, you may not remember me, but, or sometimes they'll write me a note, particularly since I've allowed my name to be placed for president. A lot of people have seen that on Facebook. They've written me. But one of the interesting things they'll say over and over again is that I grew more during those 9 years or whatever years I was with you at First Baptist Church of Norfolk than any other time in my spiritual life. Now, part of that, I think, and they would say so, was because I tend to be an expository preacher that will go through books, and I will also go through kind of spiritual disciplines. I did a series on core convictions, major doctrines of the faith. So I preached on the doctrine of hell. I preached on the doctrine of heaven. And so I think a lot of pastors underestimate the power of that pulpit to disciple people. It shouldn't be the only place, but it should be a primary place. So that means you got to think through your preaching. I would take a time out every year in January, and I would go somewhere alone, just with my Bible and maybe a few commentaries, and I would take all of the sermons that I preached over the last year, the title, the theme, what the major emphasis was, and make sure that my preaching was a full order preaching, that I'm covering most everything. And then I would decide next year's series based on where I felt were the needs in the church, whether it was a family need or a better Bible study need or whatever, so that I'm looking at the church through that lens of thinking, am I producing men and women who love God with their heart, soul, and mind, their neighbor as yourself? And if not, how can I do that? So don't neglect the power of the pulpit in the whole discipling process. The third thing I would kind of say, then you guys may want to jump in and ask me more specifics, so I don't want to just take up your whole time. The person is more important than the curriculum always. And I think a lot of churches get so hung up looking for the right curriculum. We just need this. When you ask people who are discipled about that process of discipleship, they rarely remember the process or the curriculum, but they remember the person who discipled them. Yeah. So a lot of times I think we're kind of waiting till we get the exact right tool or set of tools, then we're going to begin it. No, you're already in it. You're either doing it well or you're not doing it very well. So make sure the pulpit has that discipling theme to it. Now, that doesn't mean you don't preach evangelistically. You do, because there may always, and in almost any text, you can get to Jesus from it, and you want to do that because you don't know who there. But the other thing I found about preaching evangelistic is it helped your people know how to explain the gospel. Mm-hmm. So many times people who are sitting in the pews are really clueless about how would I explain this to somebody. So there's no reason not to do that on a regular basis, because repetition works really well in that. Most discipling plans are going to have to be customized based on the location of your church and time issues. For example, the Norfolk church, we had a lot of military. That meant that we couldn't always strategize for them to be there 4 or 5 weeks in a row, or 10 or 12 or 16. So we had to think differently about how we would do that, because sometimes they were on a cruise. And so sometimes we had to build material, whether it was on, I'm going to date myself, cassette, not 8-track, guys, not that bad, but whether it was cassette or now a CD-ROM or any of those things that we can put in their hands that they can use. Or I think businessmen today in their car, that we've got to think, on how do we get these materials to them at a point where they can use them, not because it is both material, curriculum, and it is person driven. So we do have to think about what are some good tools that I could use, that I can put in their hands. How can I help them in this context? So a lot of times we might do a discipling weekend, kind of like we've developed the Disciple Now for youth. Well, adults still respond to things like that. We did a lot of our teacher training, which is a discipling thing. We called it Friday Night Madness. And we would come about 7 o'clock and stay till midnight. It was the latest most of our people had stayed up, since they were in a lock-in at junior high. So about 9 o'clock, we'd have hot fudge sundaes and coffee to get enough buzz on to make it till midnight. But you'd be surprised how much you can do in an uninterrupted period of 4 or 5 hours. So think through your people, think through your location, and customize it. Even if it's in a 6-week format, you can do a 6-week format in 1 weekend, if that helps.
And on our end, talking about customizing, as you were talking, I realized how awesome our ladies are at this. We've got ladies that are doing a lot of one-on-one things and so forth. And one of our biggest areas of need is our men. And that kind of ties into our last study on, reaching young men. But how we've customized it for us is we've got a couple of young guys that are ranchers. And they came up and asked me, said, Pastor, ride a horse? And I said, no, I have, but it's not something I make a regular, recurring thing of part of my life. But what we're going to do now is on Mondays, we're going to get together, and he's got, little, I don't even, I'm not a rancher. I'm not a cowboy, so I don't know what these things are called. But basically, it's a calf that he's going to pull with an ATV. We'll be on the horses, and we're going to be roping them and learning just horseman skills and all of that kind of stuff. And there's about 3 or 4 guys that are going to do this. And then at the end of that night, once we're done, we're going to eat, get by the campfire, and I'm going to teach a Bible study and do, it won't be one-on-one, but 1-on-3 or so of guys that are kind of in the same context, young kids and all of that, to really build that fellowship together and discipling together on their turf, because that's a hard part for pastors. Is we often want people to come to our turf, come to the church, come to the church, but getting out where they're at, especially when, I think we shared when you were on last time, how everybody has to drive 20 to 30 minutes to get to our church. And so if I can go where they're at, do something that they enjoy, and tie in the disciple making, then I feel like it's a win-win.
And
Great.
and I
Go ahead. I was just saying it's a great concept.
Well, and I was just
you hear
saying,
that, Kyle?
Yes, yes, it was great.
Say that one more time, Dr. Hemphill. I'm just kidding.
Before Kyle gets on, I got to tell you, I rode a horse once. Once is the directive word. My wife was big into horses. She had 3 at one time. So she wanted me to go on a trail ride with her. I want to do something with my wife. This has nothing to do with church growth, so just bear with me here a second. So this trail ride, the first day was 8 hours with someone who had not ridden a horse, except maybe 30 minutes at the fair somewhere where they let them run in circles. So on the way back in, the horse realized that I didn't know what I was doing, and it was time for him to get me off. So he gallops all the way to the plain. And if you ever sat on a horse for 8 hours, I am telling you, every bone in my body, and particularly ones I sat on. So the next morning, they were going for another ride. So I missed my discipling chance because I was sitting on 3 pillows just to eat breakfast. So I suggest you break it in slowly, if you would.
Yeah,
all right, back to you. Something serious.
We'll begin. Yeah, Kyle, try to do something.
Yeah, I don't have a horse story.
He's a cowboy fan. That's close enough.
I'm trying to think. I was trying to think what I was going to say. I think. So you talk about meeting people on their own turf. One of the things I've learned too is meeting guys on their own time.
Yeah, and
it goes back to the same thing. We try to work people into our schedule so often. And Dr. Hemphill, much like you at Norfolk, this is Alamogordo is a military community. We have an Air Force base here, and so I mean, I've done breakfast with guys at 4 o'clock in the morning because that's when they get. I mean, Matt's up and running. I'm usually not at that point. So, but whenever, and that's what I've told guys. I said, man, whatever your schedule is for that week, we have the luxury of being full-time pastors. So for some guys maybe who are listening or in bivocational settings, this could be a little bit more difficult if you still have to get up and go to do a real job throughout the week. But, for us, I'll get up and I'll do breakfast with somebody whenever, and then I can go back home and sleep for a couple of hours because I've already put in a little bit of work. But that's been something that's really helped me understand is, I can tailor my schedule to do one-on-one discipleship whenever somebody's available. So I was telling you earlier, we met with a guy yesterday, middle of the afternoon. I'm meeting a guy for lunch tomorrow. So it's but it's making that concerted effort to get in their lives and not just saying, you come to church and the only time we do discipleship is Wednesday night or Sunday morning. No, and I think this is on the pastors to kickstart it. Because if we're going to ask anything of our people, I think we've got to be leading that and say, man, find a guy and start meeting with him as regularly as possible. And whether that's just you sit down and go through a book of the Bible, or if you have a discipleship curriculum, whatever, you start pouring into him and see if that doesn't start a fire in your church of discipleship, which will then lead to revitalization.
Well, and you talked about a curriculum there. A few years ago, I was teaching discipleship at Southern Seminary as a kind of visiting professor there. So I kind of set an assignment for my class, because I developed a program or a process called Splash for leading people to Christ. Stands for show people love and share Him. Those it becomes an acrostic to it, and so it's kind of a friendship, confrontational evangelism strategy. Well, out of that, I developed Splash 2. I'm creative with these titles, but it stands for Scripture, Prayer, Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, accountability, stewardship in your heart, which is your mission. The book was actually designed for me leading somebody to Christ and then talking them through the discipling process, not to study with somebody. So it would be a good thing for what you're talking about with mentoring. But I want to go on and to pick up another thing here. So you're talking, and we're talking about discipleship being both intentional and spontaneous. And a part of it, obviously, has still got to be that mentoring. That's kind of the spontaneous. But then to do that, you've got to multiply it, because you can't, as pastor, mentor everybody in your church. You know, even if your wife helps mentor the women, it's too big. And as the church, as they become disciples and reach others, so you've got to get a way of duplicating yourself, of being able to release some of those people who have been mentored into the process of mentoring others. Now, let me give you one idea. Particularly, I'm going to do it for a Sunday school church first, and then one that says, no, we're into small groups. I tell people, if Southern Baptists didn't have a theological argument, they'd get into a methodological one just to have an argument going. And I tell people that Sunday school is a small group meeting in your building in a traditional hour. Small group is a Sunday school class meeting outside your building, non-traditional hour. If they're done effectively, they're both pretty much principles are the same. Now, one of the problems that we're facing today, that's why discipleship has been such an issue, is very few churches have the luxury of getting people back 2 or 3 different times a week. And so the question is, how do we do this in the limited context of the hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours they're going to make available, if we want them also having some sort of ministry role. So let me show you one way you can actually tie it to kind of the Bible study small groups. Most churches have I would call traditional Sunday school or a small group that's a Bible study oriented. You're going through a quarterly, you're going through a book of the Bible, whatever it is. Now, one of the things that we did is that we turned this into what we called a Great Commission group. So that our goal was to make disciples, but we had a going outreach leader for each group. We had a teacher for each group. And then for baptism, an assimilation leader, we call the care leader. So in all of our groups, we used deacons as the primary care minister for each group. Then under that deacon, there were up to 4 care leaders. And those 4 care leaders could have up to 4 persons or 4 couples. So in a couples group, there would be 8 people there. Now, what you can do is you cannot do the discipling through the Sunday school because there's not enough time. Particularly if it's Sunday morning, you've got that 45 minutes or an hour. By the time they drink the coffee and discuss who lost recent ball games, etc., and you get to study, you know, your time is limited there, and then you've got to go on to worship service or whichever the case may be if you're in flip-flops. But you can do it through the Sunday school. So if you disciple the care leaders, and then as new Christians are formed, link them to that care leader so that a care leader is never more than 4 persons away. So one person can disciple 3 or 4. So that's a way you can actually organize your small groups so you don't have to come up with multiple organizations, particularly if your Sunday school or your small groups are pretty much age graded, which goes with homogeneity and receptivity. That allows you to have people meeting together, whether they do it in their home, at a restaurant, or anywhere else for this. So that's a unique way of trying to pull those two together so you don't run 5 different organizations.
Yeah. Go ahead. I thought you were going to say something.
I'm
So
soaking in,
Like
man.
he was, me too.
I thought so.
Looked like he was having a brilliant thought there.
Yeah, well, I can assure you it's not that.
No, that's definitely not
I
it.
think one of the things I learned today is if you'll notice, Dr. Hemphill spoke on the importance of the pulpit.
Yep.
And you'll notice that he did not say the table.
That's right.
So Kyle preaches from this little bitty table because he's so cool. He's up there in probably shorts and flip-flops or something. And I'm also glad that in our first question, you're asking, what does a disciple look like? I'm glad you didn't say like clean shaven, because I feel like I'm still safe on that one. But
most of the early disciples may have had a full beard like yours, since they have a Jewish heritage, you know.
Yeah, and I'm sure it was bright red like mine as well. But we're out of time, Dr. Hemphill. We're so grateful that you sat down with us again, and we thank you for listening. No, there's a number of other things you could be doing, but you decided to listen to this dumpster fire. We hope it was somewhat helpful today, brought you some encouragement. And if you haven't, be sure to subscribe on iTunes or whatever podcast feed you use, and visit us online at www.notanother.baptistpodcast.com, or on Facebook under our name, or on Twitter at NAB_podcast. Until next time, may your coffee be as black as night and as bold as the gospel you
declare.
Oh, come on. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hemphill, and thank you for listening. Have a great day.